So it's just like every other. So we're live and streaming. And I'm not promoting it because I just want to try it out this week, just to see if it works. The bandwidth is fine right now.
Okay.
I think it'll just be over time. It might get a little strained. So I'm going to close Chrome. I'm going to trust you guys with the notes. I'm just going to facilitate conversation and make sure the tech aspects of everything work. Josiah, do you have your notes?
I do.
Yes. Okay, there's that. Okay, I'm going to play the theme song, and then we're going to get started.
Awesome.
Hold on just a second. Okay.
Let's go through it.
Ah, you... I should just leave it. I think I'm just going to leave it. Let's just play through it. This is how it happens. Hey there, podcast listeners, and welcome to the Principled Uncertainty Podcast. I'm your host, Tyler, and joining me tonight are two regulars. Can't wait to get into our discussion tonight. It is Josiah and Tommy. How are you guys doing?
Doing great.
That is awesome.
Glad to talk about this book.
Yeah, we're doing
Tommy read like a month and a half ago.
I know Tommy's been done since before it was published. He was reading the galleys. So we are doing something a little bit different this week. It's not going to be a video games talk. Even though we're like in the midst of video game season, we're going to take a break and talk about something that is kind of like video games, but you read it and don't interact with it at all except by thinking about it as you read it.
Oh,
these things are called
adventures.
Books. Yeah, text adventures. So we're going to be talking about books once a month. Hopefully, we're going to be able to do a podcast episode about a book that we are reading and interested in. So this is the first of those. Also, we are live streaming on Ustream until my bandwidth crashes and everything goes to hell, and then we'll just be a podcast again. So we're flying a little too close to the sun. So let's get into it and test out our wax wings, fellas. So, who would like to volunteer to tell us about the first book that we chose? Josiah, why don't you give us a little history? Like, you were the guy who sort of initiated this whole thing, so why don't you jump right in and talk about it a little bit?
Okay. So there's a new book called Perfidia. It's new as of about 2 months ago, I'd say. That is written by James Ellroy, and he's you've probably at least heard of the movie L.A. Confidential, people who are listening. And he wrote the book that was based on. And also there's a book called The Black Dahlia that a much less good film was made of about 10 years ago at this point. But anyway, he's someone who writes about like L.A., Los Angeles police, murder, crime type stories set back in the 50s. And if you've played the game LA Noire, that's basically all just kind of, that's basically like a video game version of his milieu where every cop is corrupt somehow, every interaction is racially charged, and every woman hides some kind of dangerous, sexy secret. It's basically it's kind of noir, but kind of pushed to an extreme, whereas classically noir is about moral grays, but in James Ellroy, the morality is ambiguous, but everyone is terrible. So it's all about different shades of terrible. And go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say different shades of terrible is actually what I was going to name my book for this year.
But so Perfidia is the latest book in James Ellroy's ongoing project. And back in the late 80s, I think 87 is when Black Dahlia came out. And it's not his first book, but it's his first book that anyone talks about. And that is about people, LAPD cops, investigating the very famous murder of Elizabeth Short, which to this day has not been solved. And it's him offering kind of his imaginary solution to that murder, and also using that as a way to kind of look at his own fictionalized Los Angeles, which would have been the LA that was about 10 or 15 years before he started growing up in that same LA. So he's kind of obsessed with the place of his birth. And
also, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say he's also obsessed with it because his own mother died in a very similar sort of unsolved rape murder case, which he doesn't shy away from like making the connections between his own relationship with his mother and
The
the
Black
Black
Dahlia.
Dahlia. Yeah.
Yeah, and just kinky sex murder in general.
Hmm.
But so he wrote The Black Dahlia, and then the next book after that was called The Big Nowhere, and that was continuing. There were some overlapping characters in that, but it wasn't really a sequel. And then he wrote LA Confidential third, which is probably my favorite of these early LA based books. And then after that, he wrote a book called White Jazz. Oh, sorry about that.
Yeah.
Um, he wrote a book called White Jazz that was very much like a stylistic departure that a lot of people don't really like very much. But anyway, he put the books to bed for a while. He finished basically had said everything he wanted to say about LA at that point. And then I can't remember, it was in maybe the late 90s he wrote a book called American Tabloid that was about the Kennedy assassination. But it wasn't just about the Kennedy assassination. It was about the James Ellroy version of the Kennedy assassination. So there were a lot of manly men being manly and racist and very sexy women and all kinds of different shades of terrible going on around the Kennedy assassination. And that's by far my favorite Ellroy book. But he wrote two more books after that. So there's a trilogy that involves the Kennedy assassination, and the next book involves the Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King assassinations. You get two assassinations in one book there. And then the third book is basically kind of everything up to just shy of like Watergate era. So like up to the death of J. Edgar Hoover, I think is where that one ends.
So jump into why you decided, like why you thought it was interesting for us to sort of, like why do you think it was cool for us to try out a book club? What possessed you to do that?
Mostly I just thought it was like I don't know, so the Idle Thumbs guys had done it, and it seemed cool. And I don't know, Perfidia, I knew that you were kind of an Ellroy buff, and I was going to read it anyway. I figured you'd probably read it at the same time, and I didn't know if Tommy was in. It wasn't military sci-fi or Tolkien, so I didn't know he was game for that. But,
Josiah, I'm gonna go to Tommy for a second. Your audio is kind of going haywire a little bit, so I'm gonna go to Tommy for a second. No, it's fine. Tommy, you have a different background with Ellroy, which is to say that what?
Which is zero at all and no noir and anything.
So
nor have I even seen LA Confidential.
Okay, so you like, as far as this sort of stuff goes, you're just like not. Have you just never been interested in detective novels, or like what was it? Just the idea of talking to us that brought you into this, or like were you just like, oh, James Ellroy, this is someone that I might need to know, or like what was your thought?
You guys recommended it, and I was like, oh, there's a huge gap in my reading. May as well, So jumped in and really enjoyed it.
All right, so that's your overall impression, though. Like you said, you really blew through this book, so you have quite the commute.
It's a fast mover, and and it was in audiobook format, so I don't have I wasn't able to take notes on it per se. Just a bunch of mental notes up in here.
So how long so the first question I kind of have about the book is how long did it take for, like, Josiah, you are way more of an Ellroy buff than I am. I've read his lesser known books. Like I read the LA Noir trilogy that was
it's a quadrilogy. Actually.
Yeah, well, I read the book that is LA Noir that is composed of three small novels that is not he has an LA Noir trilogy, but I read a book called LA Noir that is a trilogy of novels that have nothing to do with his later LA Noir trilogy.
Oh yeah, my bad. I was like, I haven't even read those books.
I've read a lot of his minor novels. I've avoided the bigger ones because a lot of them get adapted, or I don't feel like reading 3 books in a row and I never know which one to pick up. It's kind of like getting into Terry Pratchett.
They're kind of dense too in their way.
So I read Blood on the Moon is the first of the LA Noir trilogy, and that's kind of it's kind of his Red Dragon, and it's really good and interesting and messed up. And also it has a lot of the themes of another serial killer novel he wrote in the mid-'80s called Killer on the Road that I also recently read and really liked. But I've never really read his big books. Like I don't have a lot of, I watched LA Confidential a lot, but I've never read it. And I've watched Black Dahlia several times. I've tried to read it twice, but I can't because I have the movie in my head and the movie's not very good.
Oof.
I think you said there was like a film of stringy nastiness that on that book, or there's some kind of like very gross sensory way that you described it that I think is pretty fitting.
Yeah, so I don't have, so I know a lot of Ellroy's stuff, but I haven't read, like I own a lot of Ellroy's books, I just haven't read all of them. So I cannot purport to be like the master of his domain. But how long did it take for you guys to, I guess first of all we should give an introduction to the book. Perfidia's basically.
Oh, and you gotta establish your level of spoilers ahead.
Oh yeah, there will be
point.
spoilers throughout the podcast, and if I could put spoilers even before this, if I could like record something later and then put it before all this, I would even do that too, so I could have spoilers even before I mention spoilers.
Yeah, we couldn't talk about it without spoiling it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So Perfidia is his, like how he encounters the Japanese American experience and all of the horrific things that happen. And I actually didn't think I was going to be convinced by James Ellroy's treatment of Asian Americans during World War II, but I was actually really impressed with how he encountered the subject matter. I thought it was just going to be like, oh, they're just going to be the background noise for all of his cop stuff, and that happens some too, but it's actually a really interesting book about it ends up getting solved, but basically an unsolved murder that takes place the night before Pearl Harbor. And I became utterly fascinated. I galloped through the last half of this book because it was so amazing.
Yeah.
So Perfidia, the thing that's really interesting about that, I thought it'd be interesting that it's a prequel to his whole LA noir and American tabloid project. Mm-hmm. So basically there's characters from both the quadrilogy that comes, the LA noir kind of, I mean, not LA noir, sorry. What does he call it? The Underworld USA is the trilogy with the tabloid books. And I think it's just the LA Quartet is what the first four books are called. So you have characters from the LA Quartet showing up 5 to 10 years earlier. So you see a lot of younger versions of characters that show up in books that Ellroy wrote 20 to 30 years ago. And then there's also characters from the much later Underworld USA books. So the people who were investigating or instigating the Kennedy assassination show up in much younger iterations or incarnations in this book. So I thought it'd be interesting to read it as someone who has like gone through all of the kind of canonical Ellroy corpus. And I thought it'd be interesting to kind of get my perspective, of course, because I also just like really wanted to read Perfidia because I love Ellroy so much. But then I also thought it'd be interesting to see somebody like, like Tyler picking it up without having read all those books. Yep. If you were willing to do that. And then Tommy doing that was even better.
I know.
So, other extreme.
Yeah, so I wanted to see like if this worked as a book. This was kind of my mad science experiment to see if it worked as a book for someone coming to it cold as well as it does for somebody who's obsessed with Ellroy. Yeah. So I'm really curious. So that's the prequel status is one of the reasons why I really wanted to go into this.
So Tommy, what's your take on, like, there's 10 million characters in this book. So what was your take on reading it? Did it take a long time for you to be able to settle into like, all right, this guy is this guy and this guy is this guy? There
were definite like conflating, I guess, with characters for a bit at the beginning, but I really like books with a large cast.
Yeah.
I like the challenge of like, now remember this guy and, this huge dramatis personae and stuff like that.
Yeah,
so
there actually is a dramatis personae at the end of the book.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. I thought it really worked. I mean, he going in completely cold, the absolute coldest, much like my rap career.
Cold as ice. That's right.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. I mean, like he wrote these, he gave everyone, their own arc that was set up pretty sufficiently at the beginning and or whenever they're introduced. And then, halfway through it or towards the end when you guys just sort of mentioned in passing, these are well-established characters and stuff. I was like, it was one of those Clarence moments.
Well, I actually debated on whether or not to mention it to you at all, Tommy, because I didn't want to.
This is all just a very unethical science experiment.
Yeah, like I debated on whether or not to tell you that they were reoccurring characters at all, because I didn't want you to go like, oh, well, shit, why am I reading this if there are always like all this other backstory?
I should just read the wiki about all these guys. Yeah.
Yes. And so I really did debate on whether or not to say anything at all, but did it affect your experience of reading it? Were you more like, oh, okay, that's why we're talking about Lee Blanchard and Bucky Bleicher, these characters who have appeared in so many other books?
I mean, I didn't understand the significance of some of them, you know, especially the ones who were like sort of conspicuous but didn't get much screen time, I guess.
Yeah.
And then, you know, so catching up with you guys was definitely informative for, you know, oh, that's why.
One of the
this
things
book is weird too, because like a lot of the minor characters, like Buzz Meeks, who's Russell Crowe's character in LA Confidential, he kind of dips out halfway through the book, but he does some really important stuff. Whereas I feel like if he didn't exist in other books, they wouldn't have given him so many weird times to shine. And like, I think Scotty Bennett is someone who does some like really important stuff for the plot later in the book, even though he's not a very major character. And I think the fact that they exist outside of the book does affect the kind of, I don't know, like the heavy plot lifting that Ellroy allows them to do, which I think is kind of weird and interesting.
So it's also trippy from a perspective of him sort of grafting this whole, you know, this whole cast onto a sort of real life time period and real people sort of wander in and out. Sometimes for like for so long that I'm like, why are we still on this real person?
Yeah,
you know
it's
what I mean?
Really bizarre. And it just
why is Betty Davis having sex all the time?
Yeah, why? It seems as though like one of the reasons he exists is to just completely tear apart our like conception of history, because in the documentary Feast of Death that's about him, one of the things that really
it sounds like a real lighthearted,
I know, it's just it's called James
Netflix.
Ellroy's Feast of Death. I mean, he's kind of an asshole. Like that's kind of his persona.
He's a huge asshole.
And so one of the things that he talks about is like he says that he hopes that he lives one day longer than Bill Clinton, so he can write the book about Bill Clinton's legacy. Like he wants to tear it apart the way that he did Camelot. And
he can do that now.
Yeah, but he wants to do his very like. The Clintons are very litigious. We all know that. So, like, I think he wants to wait until they die so he can be like, I make everything up that he wants to make up, because whatever, dead people have no right to that sort of stuff.
Oh, that's not weird. I hope you die so I can write about you.
Yes, that's what he wants. He was like, I hope I can write about that crooked son of a bitch. Like, that's kind of how he takes it. And so,
but in a much cooler voice. I heard an audio interview with him, and I was very impressed by his vocal stylings.
I've been doing like weird Ellroy impressions this whole last month. Like they're not very good.
I was gonna say, do you want to give it a shot? Should we lean back in our chairs and let you do an Ellroy?
I have to like. There's one the answer that he had to a question I asked when I went to a signing. I can kind of do in his voice because I actually heard it, but that will come to that later.
Okay, we've teased it enough for everyone, but yeah, Ellroy. I mean, he's just a really great writer. But the weird thing about Ellroy too, for me, is that he knows he's a really great writer, and so he has a very conflated sense of his own like worth. He calls himself. Who does he say he is the what of crime fiction? He doesn't say he's the Shakespeare of crime fiction, but he says he's like the Faulkner of crime fiction or something.
I mean, Faulkner kind of already was the Faulkner of crime fiction.
Right. I
mean, if you read Sanctuary, or he wrote part of the screenplay for The Big Sleep. But yeah, I can't remember. I don't remember. He actually talked shit about Faulkner when I saw him. Ellroy talked shit about Faulkner when I saw him live, so I don't think he would say that.
No.
He actually bragged about having never read Faulkner.
Of course.
This is the ego we're talking about here.
Yeah, he doesn't need it. He doesn't need it because he is his own Faulkner. Like he's so egotistical. I mean, I love the guy's writing, but he's more
Hemingway than Faulkner. I mean, his style is he writes. This book has more of kind of a normal, like varying between short and medium length sentences, but White Jazz is the fourth book in the LA Quartet, and The Cold 6000 is the second book in Underworld USA, and those books are both known for being kind of punishing in that like every sentence is like 7 words or less, and you'd think that wouldn't affect how you read it, but when you have a lot of the stops on the page, when the sentences are all that short, you hit a period and your brain makes you stop for a quarter of a second, those add up. So like those books, even though they're not any longer than Perfidia, both took me like twice as long to read.
See, like that I could
But
see.
that's the kind of crazy shit that Ellroy likes to do.
Well, see, that's the thing I could also say about Ellroy, that like I would not put him. That aspect of the style I could see in relationship to Hemingway, but he's more. I'm trying to think of someone who is stylistically similar to him, because he writes so, like, his writing is just so, he writes from the bone almost, like he doesn't cut to the bone, but it seems like he writes from the bone in some way. Like everything is in his marrow, and everything that he writes is just so weird and from a very specific place that I don't know. It's so bizarre.
There was a little.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just thinking he's like also his fascination with mid-century weird colloquialisms. He just knows all these like weird sayings that that you would never know because you're not obsessed with the 50s the way he is,
or grew up in it. Yeah, like he has a very specific like entree into that world. Yeah, Tommy, what were you saying?
Yeah, speaking of your 7-word Hemingway sentences, it's like if Hemingway repeated himself a lot and was kind of a big racist.
Right.
No, I definitely I have topics to talk about, and race, ethnicity, I think was the first one on the list. But we should probably dig into the actual plot of the book itself if you guys are ready.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I should have looked into this, but do you know if this is based on a real unsolved case
I'm sure, but it's definitely heightened for tension.
So it's several a family of Japanese people are killed in a crime on the night before Pearl Harbor, and it's the killing was made to look like they all committed harakiri, or harakiri if I'm a white guy pretending like I know how to pronounce Japanese things. So they're all basically with ceremonial samurai sword suicide, but as a family group. It's just a weird scene, and it doesn't it's. If you're reading a crime novel, you instantly know that this couldn't have actually been done by them. It was made to look like suicide. But anyway, so that's where the book kicks off. And
go
ahead, Tyler.
I was just gonna say that it's a really crazy bananas police procedural, and one of the things that's really fascinating to me is I am not a fastidious writer, and so how he is able to sort of like pass out information, drop little nuggets of information over the course of this novel is really, really crazily fascinating to me, because
he is in control of everything.
Yeah. Like
he talked about how he had an outline for this book that's like 600 pages long, typewritten. Supposedly, that's almost as long as the book itself.
Yeah.
But go ahead, sorry.
No, yeah, I mean, and that's something that I really admire about him, is the way that he is in control of information. Like everything, he's definitely a control freak as a writer, but I also admire how well he's able to impart knowledge to the audience without giving them too much. And it always feels like he's giving you the right amount of information. And it seems like, how is he ever going to, at one point in this book, I actively thought, how is he going to tie all of this stuff together? There's no way that this will all sort of coalesce and dovetail.
Some of it, a lot of the Kay Lake, who's the woman protagonist, which is a first for Ellroy. He's never had a woman as one of his main protagonists. And
that kind of shows, I think. We'll talk about that later, but I think it kind of surprised
me, because you said that and that he had not had a white or a non-white person.
Nope. Well, he had one of the Underworld books has a black guy who's kind of sort of a point of view character, but not really. But yeah, this is the first time he'd ever had an ethnic minority.
That's a lot of books.
Yes.
Yeah. But so I think a lot of some of the stuff with Kay Lake's plot lines I thought they kind of detracted from the plot a little bit, but for the most part, everything. I mean, it's pretty staggering how much Ellroy knows exactly how many times to repeat important information, and how to juggle all those side plots and different suspects and whatnot is crazy.
Do you think you could ever write a novel like this?
Oh God, no. I would love to be able to, but no.
It just shows like his level of craft, like and how I just imagine he's one of those writers we talked about. He's like a blue collar writer. It doesn't seem like he comes by this just through gift, even though he'd like to portray himself that way. I think that he just sort of goes out to the shed and just sort of like hacks away at this thing until it becomes the thing that he wants.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's a fascinating book. One of the where should we begin as far as do you want to start? Let's start with race, because if we don't, I feel like we're ignoring like the most important
Yeah, I think so too.
aspect of the book. So
yeah, what do you think about race in the book, Tommy?
yeah,
it was definitely like having someone, your sort of intoxicated uncle who's like over at Christmas, and you're like, I don't know where he's going with this, and you're kind of afraid that and there he goes, he did it. And now the floodgates are open.
It's almost like having a mental. If you listen to the book, it's kind of like having a mental version of Tourette's, where you're just like,
exactly,
constantly like, is my brain racist? I know I'm not racist, but is my head racist? Like, what's going on?
It would almost be like Office Space, where he like turns the rap music down as the black guy walks by his car. If I stopped my car listening to this and parked next to a black person driving their car, I would feel so.
Any person. Any person. It doesn't matter. Whenever I was listening to the book, if I stopped at a red light and realized that the book, like I had turned it up really loud, I would turn it way down, because like, am I training to be a serial killer? Am I like a Klansman in training? No. So turn it down.
I mean, the first chapter is a pirate radio broadcast by the KKK.
Oh, man.
So maybe you are.
Do you think I didn't research this stuff on purpose, because I'm one of those people, like when I read a book, I kind of like to let what I believe about it stand on its own. And so some of the sort of like pseudo-historical stuff, like I decided not to research, because I find it more compelling that we might have a 1940s Bill O'Reilly actually having these kinds of broadcasts and sort of wondering if they were true than actually... That's actually something that I want to get into a little bit, and maybe like... I don't want to shelve race, but I also want to make sure we bring this up later, which is Ellroy's books are always overtly political, but this seems to be the most prescient, like with regard to today. Like it is about the politics of the past, but it also is a nice analog to this sort of modern era of terrorism. Like it's sort of a weird analog to that. And so I wonder, I know that was intentional on his part, but it's also like it's very prescient. So I think we need to talk about that later. But let's stick with race first, because that's important.
Yeah, what do you think about Hideo, Tommy? I remember you had you had conflicted views on him.
You called him a creeper, if I may.
Yeah, you said he seems innocent, but he's a creeper.
This is the one thing that I think if I'd read more noir fiction, I'd probably have not fallen into this trap. But like I kept on looking for the good guy,
right?
You know, and I never found him. Even in Hideo, even though Hideo seems like maybe he was the closest thing to a white knight protagonist.
And he's
I think Ellroy would appreciate that. What you just said.
Oops. Well, now I feel terrible about it.
Well, what are your other impressions about race in general, like how it is portrayed in there? Do you find how he portrays people to be racist, or merely his colloquialisms, like merely the way that the characters talk? Like
that's a really perceptive question.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to defer that one to a smarter, more read person.
Well, Josiah, I like the way that one of your notes or emails talked about racism in the authorial voice and not just in like dialogue, because Ellroy's one of the few authors who will allow his narrators to be racist and will not shy away from, like, even when he's speaking in the third person, will not shy away from using racist language, which is really interesting because most modern writers will not do that. They will let characters speak with a racist tone.
Like, but that wasn't me.
Right, first person narrator gets more leeway too. I mean, like Huck Finn being the classic example.
Well, but I'm saying even when there are moments where, like, one of the things Ellroy does is kind of he dips in and out of point of view, and there are points where he's definitely in the point of view of the character, but there are times where he's speaking like more like objectively, and even when he's in an objective voice, he still uses racist language, which is really interesting.
It'll be if there's two black convicts or if there's two like black drug dealers and the cops roll up to talk to them. He won't say there are two black drug dealers. He'll say there are two N-words dealing drugs. Right. I mean, that's how it. Which you don't get that much in this book. The Martin Luther King book had so much black racism that I had a really hard time finishing it. This one is more about the kind of Asian fear of Japanese people, which is just as bad. But
and also not like
I grew up in the South, so like the the anti-black racism, like kind of I don't know. It was like more where I live, I guess. But yeah, the thing about the third person, he's kind of just said basically that he doesn't care, right? I mean,
he just says like if you don't like that I write this way, then don't read my books. I mean, I'm doing this on purpose. So if you don't like it, don't think what you want, but if you don't like it, don't read it. I mean,
I felt like and obviously this was my first experience with it, but I mean, I felt like my defenses were just like kicked down in the first chapter. I was like, okay.
I kind of felt that way too. And I had just read the Black Dahlia. So like this one is like just amped up even from that. That was his first book of like saying the N-word in the authorial third person voice. So this book's a lot more intense.
It's also, I think, as far as Ellroy goes, I think what's weird though is that he still portrays this thing that a lot of people don't write about. A lot of people choose not to write about this era in American history because it's so weird for the way that it played out, and he tackled this subject, and still, even though he has a lot of racist characters in the book, and still also has there's still a lot of racism in the book, he still manages to castigate the people who take this on, and to it shows how ridiculous all of these assholes are who perpetrate all of this. At the same time, even though he's sort of glorifying some of the most awful people on the planet, he's also showing how they are awful people as well. And there is no sense of right and wrong here. Well, I mean, there is, but it's all sort of muddled together. And he's one of the few authors, I think, who successfully pulls off the idea of gray area in a book.
Yeah, it's there's actually one direct quote that I have written down in my notes that actually it's that Gerald L.K. Smith, the KKK radio host, the old school Bill O'Reilly you were talking about earlier. And at one point he's tangentially involved in the case, and he's playing golf with somebody else, and he talks about actually his friend Dr. Fred Hiltz, who's I think a psychologist, who's I can't even remember how he's involved in the case. It's so the plot gets so labyrinthine by that point. But at any rate, Hiltz says something about at one point he talks about his own racist pamphleteering operation, because people, they were into they didn't have the internet, so they would write crazy racist shit and put it out in pamphlets. And so Hiltz at one point says, "We're proponents of first American discourse, and we revere our native rights of free speech. Also, it's fun to stir up shit from conflicting perspectives and see how it all comes out in the wash."
Yeah.
And I was like, that is basically, to me, I've seen Ellroy basically say that exact same thing about race in his books. He's like, I just like the race shit. I like seeing how it pisses some people off, and other people praise it as me just being brave and direct. And
I thought it was strange that right after that they looked directly into the camera for a very long scene. Kind of a wink.
I will say if I had to say there was one thing that was most racist about Ellroy's writing, it's not that he uses racist language, but that I'm going to sort of crib from Anita Sarkeesian. When
Gamergate won't go away.
Right.
It found us even in a book club.
So the idea that in video games, women are merely the sort of background violence, I find that to be true in Ellroy's books about minorities. And I think that's that if there is sort of a really heavy criticism to be leveled at him, I mean, beyond the language that is somewhat defensible based on the time period, the fact that minorities are sort of at the receiving end of all of this violence is where it becomes the most like unsettling. That it's just like they're just the backdrop for white people to commit horrible atrocities.
Yeah.
Because I mean, every character there are white characters who are pummeled, but there are a lot more minorities who are just beaten and murdered,
destroyed. He likes to talk about bones shearing. Yeah. Every time you see that phrase so many times, in the bones sheared, and every time it sent a. It just made me. I had a very like adverse physical reaction to it every time. I never got used to it. Also, he refers to abortions as scrape jobs.
Oh God,
which is something unbearable. Else that I can't get used to.
I mean, that has to be something from the time period too. Like,
probably. But that whole repetition came in right then, and I was just that was a scene where I was just like I was completely immobilized by like just. The way they just kept saying it over and over and over, and it was a character speaking too.
Yeah, it was the woman she was the lesbian mother, or either the lesbian lover of Dudley Smith's nephew.
Yeah,
who talked about I did a scrape job. I did like the voice that the guy does is like it's pretty messed up.
I just did it again. I just
so I hate it. So as far as like there is also racism upon racism that I find interesting. Like we have an Asian, we have an Asian case. I would love to see this actually, a movie. I think that or a TV show, like an HBO show of like Perfidia would be amazing. What was that character's name? The Nazi, was he Chinese because he hated the Japanese, or was he
Ace Kwan?
No. Ace Kwan's the Chinese guy. I'm talking about
like Uncle Ace. I want like a Better Call Saul
right
just about Uncle Ace.
The scenes with Ace Kwan. Ace Kwan's one of my favorite characters in the book. But no, it's he's the Nazi. He's one of the first people they like sort of track down, and they beat the shit out of him and threaten to kill him, and they end up cutting his face up later in the book. His name was I'm afraid of saying something for fear of sounding racist, but his name is a racist name. His name was like
just give in.
Tommy. It wasn't Tommy Jap.
It was
something like that.
Let me look it up in my my dramatis personae.
But see, he's because he had all the swastikas tattooed on him, and he was like almost like a punk rock guy. Maybe like
it was. I'm sorry, but apologies, but it was Jimmy the Jap.
Jimmy the Jap. That's right. So not Tommy the Jap, but Jimmy the Jap. So there's
that's my actual. That's what.
That's just what you go by online. No, so like it's the sort of incestuous form of racism that the book takes at this point. Like it's fascinating.
It's so complicated. It's such a like fucked up melting pot where you have people who are American patriots who don't want us to get in the war because they hate Jews and want Hitler to win. It's crazy.
There are even Jewish characters who seem to hate the Jewish cause itself as well, because there's or are completely agnostic to it. Like not everyone in this book has the stake that you like would assign to them based on their race, gender, etc. Because it's the guy who owns the movie studio. He actively says derogatory things about Jewish people in defense of like his own financial fiduciary interests, and like that seems to be the thing that drives most people, is like either something fiduciary or something sexual or something related to drugs. Like that's fascinating.
I know that's interesting. Like by the end, you realize that like that money is actually the biggest motivator of all. That basically people are just kind of like riding on racist waves, and insofar as like that wave will get them to a place where they're making money is kind of which is a very it's a very noir like trajectory for a story.
Well, it's also like Chinatown. I mean, it becomes really about land at a certain point, which is also, I mean, that's sort of why LA became LA, is because of the sort of 1940s land grab and the way that everything got populated.
Yeah, and black people are all like redlined to go live in Watts, and then and in this book, I thought that was a really interesting way to approach the crime and make it bigger and broaden out the historical scope, was to have it about a Japanese family being murdered on the eve of Pearl Harbor, but then also to show that the conspiracy, and this is the mega spoiler, that the conspiracy is basically just to rob Japanese families of their land by forcing them into internment camps and then taking over their farms.
which actually happened.
Yeah, which I didn't know. And so like I was, that's a little bit of ethnic sensitivity that I learned from James Ellroy, oddly enough.
It's weird that people look, and I think that there are definitely some unsettling parts of the way that he portrays minorities. But I think people like what he gets away with it because people are so offended by mere language. And that's always like one of the weird things about anything is that people get so distracted by the surface thing that they don't think about the deeper issues that are really unsettling about this book and about what actually happened.
I know I had a really sad epiphany. I think I've told you about this multiple times, but my sad epiphany about halfway through the book was reading all of his little like racial slurs, and I realized how they're just very efficient words. I mean, like, please let me finish. You can say, I mean,
please
there's
continue.
there's very short one-syllable words for basically every ethnicity, and they're all offensive. And, you could say like black person or African American, and, those are both, pretty big bags of syllables that you have to get through. Right. Or Ellroy can just say, a 4-letter quick one-syllable racial slur, and that's it. He's done. He can move on. And so like for his like really rapid-fire staccato, like kind of Hemingway via Hammett type modernized style, it makes, I mean, it helps him a lot. I mean, it's kind of a strategic advantage that he's gotten to the point where he can just drop that. He's like, gotten to that kind of Quentin Tarantino serenity prayer where he can just drop all those words in without feeling bad about it. It helps his writing go faster. And I mean, I wasn't jealous of it per se, but I was kind of bothered once I realized that there was a utility to it, and it wasn't just to like piss me off and offend my liberal sensitivities.
Right. Although he definitely wants to do that as well, because he does not identify with liberalism at all. So,
no, that's
at least publicly.
Funny. There's one part, and I wanted to bring this up really quickly before we move on from race. And it's funny you're talking about him being critical of Clinton. And there's one line where Kay Lake, the woman protagonist, the
Scarlett Johansson.
Yeah, exactly. Oh yeah, I forgot that was Scarlett Johansson.
Yeah.
And Kay Lake is embroiled in trying to find. She ends up getting recruited to go in the underground kind of subversive leftist pro-communist LA community of kind of dilettantes, and she ends up going to this one party to get in close with one lady who's kind of the key leftist dilettante subversive communist of LA. And anyway, Kay is told at one point that someone tells her, someone says, an American Negro with leftist cachet and snob appeal will soon appear and validate our enlightened good taste. And I could not help but feel like that was probably Ellroy like taking a dig at Barack Obama, who he's like come out against multiple times. Yeah. And I was like, with leftist cachet and snob appeal to validate our enlightened good taste. And I was like, I guess, I mean, I really hated it, but I was like, I mean, I couldn't argue with a lot of that,
Well, I mean,
as far as my own feelings when I was voting for him twice, not saying that defines the Obama legacy, but I was like, that was a dig that I took kind of personally.
Well, I think that, I mean, that label could be applied to any sort of African-American leader. I mean, more directly, probably someone from the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
Right? No,
well, yeah, I could see that, but I just thought about like the snob appeal thing. I think is what really clinched it. I was like, oh, these people used to complain about Barack Obama eating arugula or whatever. I don't know. We don't have to go down that too long. It was just like Ellroy making fun of me personally.
The thing that bothered me most about the book, I guess not the most, but one of the things I noticed that really bothered me was how much a female character took on Ellroy's own feelings about boxing.
Yeah,
and like having Kay.
Yeah, you want to move into gender, sexuality.
Yeah. Let's talk about Kay Lake. Kay Lake's obsession not only with Bucky Bleicher, which to me is a stand-in for James Ellroy. Like when they describe him, the reason he's called Bucky Bleicher is because he has big buck teeth and he's not entirely attractive. I guess he is kind of, but I think he's sort of a stand-in for
sexy.
Ellroy.
I mean, men and women in this book want to do it with him.
That is very true. So he's a good, I know that Ellroy
he's
doesn't.
He's a butterface. He's a butt his face.
Kind of, yeah. I think Ellroy doesn't entirely think of Bucky Bleichert as himself, but I think he kind of wants that. And Kay Lake is the ultimate woman here, but also she has him. He has her like embody all of the stuff that he himself wants. Like if there's anything like that I don't like about Ellroy is that every character is sort of like has to spew the things that he himself believes a lot of times, like especially about boxing. Having a female character become obsessed with the ins and outs of boxing is such an eye-rolling idea, especially this character who is such an intellectual. Is like, oh, and I've gone and watched Bucky Bleichert box every day, and this is what he does with his right cross. Like, give me a break, Jesus.
I have huge problems with the K-Leg chapters.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, and do you want to talk about why those are different, either Tommy or Tyler? Why the K-Leg chapters are different?
Yeah,
from
Tommy,
the
I feel like
chapters?
I've been monologuing, so why don't you jump in and talk about K-Leg?
Yeah, and so hers stands out because it's all kind of diary entries,
epistolary.
I'm trying to remember. Does he doesn't break from that third person sort of tone in the rest of the narration aside from her, does he really?
Nope.
And does he do that in other books at all for anyone?
Yeah, actually. So normally the standard, ever since I think LA Confidential is maybe where he started that, the standard like method of attack for James Ellroy is to have about 3 is usually the magic number for him. He'll have 3 different protagonists and he'll swap perspective from chapter to chapter. It's usually third person. And it'll just be like the first chapter is this guy, the second chapter is this guy number 2, third chapter is guy number 3, fourth chapter goes back to guy number 1. Mm-hmm. And in this book, he has 4 characters that he goes back and forth. There's two white dudes, the Japanese guy and then the white lady, Kay, who we're talking about. And in this one, Kay is the only person who kind of her mode of narration is through first-person diary entries, which I personally found kind of sexist. But what
also,
do you guys think about
that? Yes, sexist, but also a really uncreative way of delivering her narrative.
I agree.
Such a staid, like it kind of dies on the page when it's like, I'm writing about my life right here. Like, I just kind of hate it. Like, also, I always hate, to me, that sort of narrative where she's like saying I'm going to document this for posterity's sake is the same thing I hate about found footage movies when they're like, I'm just going to record everything, man, just to see how it all comes out in the end. And I really think that's an awful way of telling a story.
Like that's the first question a reader is going to have is like,
well,
why would this exist?
Yeah. Why would someone have a diary? Well,
why would you be holding that camera while a giant monster's trying to eat your friends?
It's just such a, I just hate that mode of narration because then her saying, I'm going to write all this down, it just tells the audience hey, this is a book. Yeah. And I hate that. There are so many more inventive ways of telling that story than here is my diary where I'm going to pine over Bucky Bleichert.
Yeah.
I don't know. I didn't like it. I do find it vaguely sexist as well, like that the men go out and do, but women go home and write.
Yeah. There's actually go ahead, Tommy.
Oh, just real quick. She, in a way, does she seem kind of like what's the saying that the life that's reflected upon is worth living or something along those lines?
Yeah.
But yeah, she's actually doing that and reflecting on things and not just planning and getting things done.
Right. Whereas, not just doing.
All these other characters are not really taking the time to do that, and then it's sort of bubbling out in destructive ways that they don't really want it to happen.
She also seems like she gets a little bit of sleep, and which no other character in this book seems to do. It made me exhausted listening to them not sleep for
because it's in real time. I mean, it's a 21 or 22 day period, and the book just goes straight linear, barreling ahead from hour to hour, from day to day. So it kind of, you get tired just reading it.
I can barely go 12. I can barely go 12 hours without taking a nap, let alone 2 days without any sort of sleep, and just alcohol and bennies. What are bennies? Also, by the way, not Benzedrine. Is that it? Benzedrine?
Yeah.
All I know is that Dudley Smith popped one.
Yes.
And then Dudley Smith popped one. And then Dudley Smith popped one.
He's popping bennies left and right.
Yeah.
And shearing bones.
In an odd way, I know that Dudley Smith is the worst character in the book, but in a way he's the most efficient character in the book.
Oh man, he's having more fun than anybody else.
Yes, yeah, he's definitely one of the ones like when when it's his turn to narrate, you're just like, yes.
Yeah. I can't tell you. I can't tell you how many times I went to bed when I saw the words "The Diary of Kay Lake" show up.
Yeah.
I'd hit a chapter and I'm like, oh shit, it's a Kay chapter. I think I'm tired. But like I never stopped on a Dudley chapter. But we'll get to him in a second.
What else I mean, women also fall into the same place that minorities do, like of all types in this book, in that they are just the mere background for others. Like they are acted upon.
Yeah, well, here's Lee Blanchard from one of the characters from Black Dahlia, who
Aaron Eckhart.
Yeah, Aaron Eckhart. It's funny because like if you read the Black Dahlia, he does some pretty shady shit in that book.
Yeah.
But like you read this book and you're like, holy fucking shit! I had no idea Lee was that terrible.
Impotent. Yeah well, that awful. And just like an impotent, lost human being
who's just like got no moral center. I mean, he doesn't do anything even really. I mean, he's a really, really bad person. He's just like. Killing people for mob bosses for payoffs and stuff. I mean, he's pretty awful.
But he's also at the same point, like he does that because it's almost like some weird mythical creature because it's like they say, oh, who does he do it for? Who does he kill? The guy he throws that actually happened as well. That was never solved. The guy who
the Bugsy
Siegel
sings.
Yeah. That actually happened.
Wasn't he constantly talking about like kind of being regretful about that and haunted by that memory, or is that?
That's the impression I got. Like he definitely doesn't have a moral center because he will do anything, but I think he is tortured by the things that he does.
Which is why I prefer Dudley Smith because he's that bad, but he has fun.
Yeah,
and
he's unencumbered by a conscience.
Yeah.
There's also a weird link between this book and the Bone Clocks, which is we might do next. So
yeah, I just started that one.
Great book. Anyway, I can't wait to talk about that one either.
You might want to tell people ahead of time so that they have time to read it.
Yeah, if you want to, next month we're doing the Bone Clocks, which I should announce. Maybe next week I'll be like, also the Bone Clocks.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So Kay, okay, back to Kay for 1 second, if you don't mind.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
At one point, the reason I brought up Lee was that at one point he says, it's on page 429 if you want to check. At one point he says to Kay,
wait, hold on a second, Josiah. Let me flip to that chapter in the audio version.
Let me re-download it.
I would just listen along with you.
At one point he says to Kay, your resume is the men you've screwed to get what you want. And like
Lee says that?
Point, yeah, Lee says that to her. And it's kind of true. I mean, I don't know. At least at that point it was like Kay. I have problems with Kay. She just doesn't really have her own MO for so much of this book. She's brought into what's his name, Whiskey Bill
Parker.
Whiskey Bill Parker,
who I love. Like as a character, I really dug him as a character.
Yeah,
is he in a lot of the other novels?
No, he's a real guy. So for the first time, Ellroy is like using a real person as one of his point of view characters. Ellroy's doing a lot of shit in this book that he's never done before.
Yeah.
But so anyway, she's brought into this like kind of subversive. Whiskey Bill Parker wants her to investigate the subversive, like dilettante fifth columnist people, and so she doesn't really have a job there. I mean, she doesn't do that because she really wants. She's kind of aimlessly wanting to help with the war effort, but she has a hard time enlisting. There's a phrase that the book repeats over and over that says, "The war is here," or "The war is coming. I'm going to enlist." And I could tell when Ellroy read that in person a couple of times that he was so proud of that line. And he was just like, that's it. The war is coming. I'm going to enlist. He would like stop and like look out at the crowd to like just drink in our silent adulation.
Another link between Hemingway and Ellroy is that Hemingway has a collection of stories called The Fifth Column. Done.
Oh wow, that is interesting.
And it's about fifth column activities during World War I in Spain, right? Like or
I think that's where the Spanish Civil War.
Column. Yeah, that's where that comes from. Yeah.
Yeah, we should go and explain that real quick. Yeah, they talk about that at the very beginning of there's like a prescript or at the beginning of the book that explains that it was something from the Spanish Civil War, and they had 4 columns of soldiers that were sent into battle, and so a 5th column stayed at home to like do behind the scenes like sabotage and spying. Yeah. So the 5th column just means anybody who's, anybody who's living in a place and screwing with that government to help with a conflict that's going on. So fifth columnists were like people who were like communist sympathizing subversives and stuff like that in this book anyway. So Kay is sent to mess with the fifth columnist. Then she ends up kind of having sympathies with them because she doesn't like what's happening to the Japanese people with their internment, which I can understand. And then at one point, I think in like page 430 of the book, as part of her cover, Kay is going to do a documentary about the Japanese internment. And then she decides that that's what she really wants to do. So she it takes like all over half of this 700-page book before she finally gets kind of like falls backwards into a job that she really cares about.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
And then doesn't really accomplish it. Like, that's the thing that I hate about it, is that it doesn't really go anywhere.
It takes so long for her to have a point. Like, I felt like there were just a lot of things that Ellroy wanted to explore that he couldn't figure out how to fit into the book.
It is
like
weird.
I don't think
she seems shoehorned in as an epicenter for a bunch of threads that were like, what? Why are we back here?
And in the end, everybody...
She's still a badass, though.
Yeah. She later in the book, I had no problems with her in the last 200 pages of the book.
The problem is that like she also then I forgot about the one thing.
Yeah.
Where she but the bastard pulled through. Like
which you knew he would. This is a prequel.
Yeah,
we'll go into that later.
Yeah, of course. But still, it's pretty brutal. It's just weird. It is also weird for me that she is a character who, it seems like no matter what she does, everybody's a step ahead of her for most of the book as well. Like, we knew, like, even when she kissed Hideo at the party, like, everyone knew that she wasn't really dating him. That it was just like
everyone had a good gaydar and could tell. Yeah,
I mean, this is World War II, so Gaydar's still being developed.
Right. They hadn't introduced it into submarines just yet, so it was Gaydar 1.0.
Yeah.
V1.0.
I have a theory about Kay being kind of like, I mean, I don't think Ellroy like sat down to do this, but she's kind of like a stand-in for fans of James Ellroy. At one point, she's, as part of her fifth column cover, she's talking to some kind of subversive closet activist psychiatrist, and she talks to him and says, I think she says 5 men pass through my dreams interchangeably. I call them the chaste lover, which is Lee Blanchard, since they live together and don't have sex anymore. The boxer, who
or
is
never
Bucky
really
Blikert.
did.
They had a couple of times, I think. The unruly boy, who's Scotty Bennett, who's another James Ellroy character who she has sex with, and
Whiskey Bill Parker. No,
yeah, the authoritarian is Whiskey Bill, and then the Japanese is Hideo. So basically, she talks about, and she says something about. She basically goes through and talks about all her relationship and how she kind of interacts with all of these archetypal Ellroy men. And it sounded so much weirdly like, me talking about what I think about all those characters. It was almost like James Ellroy doesn't really do meta, but it seemed like kind of almost like a meta moment to me to have a character like comment on that stuff.
But he also has her say that she's doing it just to entice him. Like, she's only doing it to fuck with him because he will fall prey to, like, that is bait for him. Like, she doesn't actually believe it. She's just saying it. But then she actually kind of does start to believe it as she talks about it. And then it becomes a theme for her character throughout the novel.
Yeah.
So it's like a codifying thing for her. So yeah, the gender stuff in this book is really weird. Also, I found the way that women are portrayed, especially actresses, are portrayed as just like, oh, they'll have sex with anything, period. Like, they are demeaned in a very purposeful way, it seemed. Like, almost as, not as Ellroy's jealousy, but maybe an extension of that, sort of like, he just wants to tear them down. But I mean, I guess that's his modus operandi for everything, is to tear everyone down. So it's just really bizarre.
What do you think about that, Tommy?
Yeah, like you were saying before, to kind of, nothing safe from the nope, there's nothing good here, nothing good
the eye of, here. He is the eye of Sauron for Los Angeles.
Oh God, thank you. Thank you for at least translating this into some kind of sensible language here.
I think Betty Davis, as far as like the women, okay, so Dudley Smith, let's talk about Dudley Smith and Whiskey Bill for a little bit, if you guys don't mind. They're an interesting set of contrasts.
The Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner of this novel.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, yeah. And so Dudley Smith is the character. He's played by James Cromwell with sinister aplomb. in LA.
And as soon as you said that, I was like, oh yeah, that's who I've been envisioning this whole time.
Just a way younger version in this book. Like I can't imagine
Yeah.
James Cromwell having sex with Betty Davis. I'm sorry.
Well,